Okay, well, welcome everyone. This is a discussion or a lecture rather on book 7 of Aristotle's Ethics. Just some of the more major points for St. Vincent College's introductory to ethics class. So this chapter, this book, focuses on the concepts of moral strength and moral weakness. Now, I think an obvious question would be to ask, well, why is this chapter in the location that it is? Which is a reasonable thing to ask. We do have to remember, as I've mentioned numerous times, these are lecture notes that Aristotle's son, Nicomachus, took. And Aristotle is certainly logical. We can always rely on him to be fairly logical. And there's usually a reason that he discusses things in certain orders. So I believe the reason that he discusses moral weakness and moral strength here, because if we've noticed, we've begun with the very nature of human life, right? The end of human life as happiness and striving towards the good. Happiness being an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. All of those fundamental principles he lays out essentially in books 1, 2, and 3. He progresses to defining virtue and then talking about, voluntary acts and involuntary acts. Some of those basic concepts without which you couldn't possibly understand the rest of the book. Then he discusses the moral virtues, and he discusses a particular virtue being justice, which is kind of for Aristotle, a master virtue, a cardinal virtue, as we would call it in the church, cardinal virtue. And then he talks about the intellectual virtues. So the major division of the virtues are the moral virtues and the intellectual virtues, the virtues by which we act and the virtues by which we think, excellences of both mind and will, essentially. They're always mixed, but I think you get the picture on that. So he's spoken about some of these basic concepts, and he's told us what the moral virtues are, what the intellectual virtues are. So what is left is the question here. And what is left is that in those various virtues and vices, there can be respective strengths and weaknesses. In other words, we already know what they are. We know what the virtues' names are. We know that virtue, aims at a particular mean between the extremes of excess and deficiency. We've learned all of that. And so now Aristotle wants to tease out a little bit more concepts concerning the fact that our mind and our will can act with strength and weakness. Imagine a kind of volume turned up or down on our intellectual behavior, whether or not it's truly right reason or right action, or whether it is not. So does that make some sense, hopefully, for those of you that are here present? Yeah. Because I think that it helps for us to know maybe why Aristotle is talking about this, for us to place it in a bit of a hierarchy in our minds in order to understand it just a little better. Okay. This is a bit of a side point, but Aristotle leads with talking about his general method, which I think is a very important thing for us to take a look at, especially for those who are beginning a study of philosophy which this is an introductory class, of course. So everyone is really beginning. Um, he outlines his method of study generally of the entire ethics here. Um, the proper procedure, and if you're using the Becker numbers, this would be like 1145 B, maybe around 3 to 8, somewhere around there. And the proper procedure to think about ethics, at least this is Aristotle's claim, is the following. First, we present phenomena. We're like, what are we talking about here? What are we looking at? Present the phenomenon. Second, present the current beliefs about the phenomenon. Say we're talking about, of course, we're in the pandemic right now. For those of you in the future that might be looking at this in the past, that first we present a phenomenon like, well, this is what's happening with the virus. Some people are arguing we should do certain measures, regarding social distancing, mask wearing. Some people are arguing it really doesn't make much of a difference, or some people are even arguing that it could be damaging. So those are phenomenon. And we move to those beliefs. That would be like the arguments about, well, this is damaging, this is not damaging. This is just, or this is unjust. Third, the problems with those theses. So you present the phenomenon, then the beliefs about the phenomenon, and then you start arguing about what are the problems with those various beliefs? What are the problems with the people that are saying we have to stay 6 feet apart? What are the problems with those people who are saying we shouldn't care about staying 6 feet apart? Okay. Then from there, demonstrate the validity about matter. And you start coming down on one side or another. How valid are those various opinions? And then if you can't demonstrate some validity, then at least you go with what seems to be the most authoritative view. Because especially in ethics, we get a lot of disagreement, don't we? So it stands to reason that this would be something like Aristotle's talking about. There might be a number of experts that are arguing about a particular issue, and he realizes that it's somewhat unresolved. Even Aristotle is saying, you know what, I'm not 100% sure about exactly what's right, but 80% of the experts are saying we should go with this. And they seem to be really good men and women. They seem to be very intelligent. So we should probably go with that view. That would be the most authoritative view if you can't actually demonstrate the validity of something. Then at least you go with authority. Okay. Argument by authority is the least strong argument that you could make. The stronger arguments are truly logical arguments. The weakest arguments are the arguments by which we say, well, so-and-so said that it was right, so I guess it's right. Well, sometimes that's a valid way of arguing, but it is usually the weaker argument. In philosophy, we like to try to go with a little bit more than just authority. We want things to make sense. So I think this is worth mentioning, and I had an aside on this in my class, and so I think that I should present some of this information. If you can see, yeah, you can see that side of the board. This is really the difference between the inductive method and the deductive method. Okay, yeah, you can see that. The inductive method and the deductive method. The method just described is essentially inductive. It starts with particulars. It starts with individual phenomenon, and it moves to general principles. So at the end of to use the argument that I already used as an example, you end up coming up with a principle like, well, we find it authoritatively true that in these circumstances, the general principle is that we should wear masks at this such and such a times, or distance at this such and such a times. And you establish a principle, would be a general principle. That's proceeding from particulars to general principles. Deductive would be the opposite. Deductive method is often used, well, it's often used in theology. Because of course in the Catholic Church, we have certain things called dogmas, which we consider to be unshakable truths, unshakable principles, like the incarnation or the Trinity, or the fact that there are 4 cardinal virtues, or there are a number of things. And an argument like a deductive argument, we could say, given that these principles are true, how can we apply those to some particular circumstances? You know, this is done, for example, in maybe sexual ethics. You know, given that marriage is between a man and a woman, or given that there are certain rules about contraception, et cetera, given these general principles, how do we apply those to this particular situation? So it would be kind of, one reasoning goes from smaller principles to general principles, and the other goes the other way, general principles down to particulars, okay? It's a very fundamentally different way of thinking about things. Mary, have you learned about those yet? Have you learned about those basic ways? No, maybe? It's a very important thing to learn early on, because these are essentially 2 major ways of thinking about a problem. So it's worth knowing. Okay. So let's proceed. We hear from Aristotle that he wants to he actually tells us, let's make a fresh start. He seems to be switching gears here. I mean, he tells us that that's, I guess, what a fresh start means, that he's going to be talking about concepts slightly different than the ones that he's already talked about, namely moral weakness, moral strength, the self-controlled person, you know, versus the person that is just morally strong. These are slightly different concepts than what he's talked about before. Now, so the fresh start that he's talking about are these concepts of, well, vice versus virtue. He's been talking about that for quite some time. Moral weakness versus moral strength, and brutishness, the quality of brutishness, essentially a kind of someone who acts like an animal, or someone who is completely crass. A modern day sociopath or psychopath, someone who's completely brutish. And you know what the opposite of that? The opposite would be someone who has heroic virtue. Or, well, in the Catholic Church, saintly virtue. I mean, we have some odd 10,000 or so canonized saints in the Roman Catholic Church that we consider heroically virtuous. So you might just be virtuous, but Aristotle wants a special quality for those above and beyond the regular virtuous, however you would call that. And I think it's worth thinking about what we consider to be heroically virtuous. This is another point that I brought up in class, because I've, you know, on the one end, you know, say you have a mother who wakes up at 4 o'clock in the morning and she starts washing clothes, and she's saying her prayers because she knows that her children are about to get up and completely storm her entire day, okay? And say she has also a job to hold down. And then she comes back pretty late at night, maybe gets 4 hours of sleep. Sometimes if she's lucky, okay, teaches her kids, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We may never find out who this woman is. She might only be known by a few people in her neighborhood and her family. But could we not, in a certain sense, call her heroically virtuous? Um, to be heroically virtuous doesn't necessarily mean that you have to pull someone out of a burning building. Like we tend to go for drama when we think about categories like that. But I think there's maybe a number of people in the world uh, who possibly have this quality of heroic virtue. It's just more silent. But the other side of that argument, and I'm not, and I'm sorry, Chelsea, but I'm not going to solve this for you, okay, is I'll give you an example. When some of our soldiers come back from war, whether, wherever it might be, they're often called heroes. I've talked with military personnel, certainly some Marines, who can't stand that, okay? And there's a reason for that. The reason why is because you know what they did? They did their job. That's what they did. They signed up for the military. They expected combat. If they didn't expect combat, well, there's something possibly a little wrong with you if you join the military and didn't at least think that couldn't be a possibility. Or I mean, you could. What if that woman that I just described? Could you just say, well, that's not really a heroic mother. That's maybe just a mother doing her job? What is over and what is above and beyond the call of duty? I get is the question, which is, I think, a very, very interesting question. But one thing I would say is we should not throw around this word heroic too easily. It's like me. So several hours of prayer a day, usually a few hours of lecture, um, spiritual direction, et cetera, et cetera. Some people, oh, Father Basil he's just really heroic. No, no. I'm just doing what I'm supposed to be doing. I don't know. I think that this is something worth thinking about, and maybe these concepts of moral strength and moral weakness will help us get a little closer to a few answers. Okay, but I think that in an intro class, those are some interesting questions to bring up. What are the qualities of moral strength and moral weakness? This is a very important question. What are the qualities of moral strength and moral weakness? I have these on the board. On the left, the morally strong person does activities that are, or has activities that are praised, generally praised by good people, people that Aristotle considers who have the use of right reason and who are themselves somewhat morally strong. The morally strong person abides by his or her calculations. They think about what is the right action, and then they do it. Okay. Finally, listens to reason. On the other side, I have the qualities of the morally weak. They usually commit actions that are blameworthy. They do not abide by their own calculations of what they should or should not do. And they usually end up getting sidetracked by their emotions. This has been a theme, right? And I think it would be incorrect to say that Aristotle is non-emotional or that he is negative about emotions. Uh, I think it's pretty clear that he thinks that a complete life, a fully happy life, brings the emotions on board, um, integrates the emotions into moral life and into the life of reason. Now, there is another school of thought, namely the Stoics, um, very, very important school of thought to study. There's much that is noble about the Stoics, but the Stoics suspect the emotions a lot more than many other kinds of philosophy. The Stoics, um, emotions make them nervous, make them very nervous, and we can't go into that. But hopefully you understand this basic distinction between the morally strong and the morally weak. Now, um, the relationship between knowledge and moral weakness. He discusses this a good bit, especially in chapter 2 and chapter 3 of book 7. And this is not an easy discussion. This is why I'm trying to keep it fairly general, because as I've said numerous times, this is an introductory class, and all I can do, and all I really want to do, is provide a general map so that you can study some of the particulars on your own a little bit better. But following Socrates, or following Plato, because Socrates never actually wrote anything, remember? His secretary, so to speak, was Plato. And even with Plato, we're not quite sure how much he's taking some dictation from Socrates and how much Plato is kind of putting, some of his own ideas in there. It's probably a mix of the two. Most scholars think that it's a mix. And there's an argument that Socrates makes that if you truly know what the right thing to do is, you will always do it. There is an argument about this, and I forget exactly where that argument's found. I'm sure you could find it on Google. But think about what that might mean. If you always know, if you know what the right thing to do is, truly know it, then you will always follow through. That knowledge, true knowledge or right reason, will lead to the correct choice, which will lead to the right action. You'll always follow through. Now, Aristotle has a problem with this. Aristotle is very critical of this because he thinks that simply by observation, okay, what we would call maybe anecdotal evidence. If you're trying to prove something and just about every single person you meet, you can see a certain situation or a certain truth play out. Well, that's anecdotal evidence. In other words, Aristotle, in his own life, certainly, and observing in the lives of others, could easily see people knowing what the right thing to do is, but not doing it. So his problem with Socrates's position is that it seems, and I stress the word seems, that Socrates doesn't even believe that moral weakness is possible. Okay, do you see how that follows? Okay, if you're always going to follow through with what you know to be right, well, there is no such thing as moral weakness. Now, there is a great argument about whether or not Socrates really, whether or not that's truly Socrates' position. I think it likely isn't. And I will only characterize this again briefly. It is a complex argument. But that, particularly in Plato's Republic, Plato goes through a good bit of lengths to describe to us by uses of figures like the divided line and the image of, or the allegory of the cave, if you've heard of these, the difference between knowledge and opinion. You can see that. The difference between knowledge and opinion. Without going too much into it, opinion is like a shadow of knowledge. You're not utterly convinced of it, and it's somewhat more shallow than true knowledge. Now, with this distinction in mind, Aristotle, I think, is willing to accept the following. Maybe if we had true, absolute knowledge, it's like, you know what, I should never, ever steal anything from anyone under any circumstances. And that's just part of your blood and bone. It's real knowledge. Then it is true that you will always follow through with that action. But what if you just have an opinion that you should never steal? Well, that's something different. That's something different. And what does Aristotle himself say about this? In our book, which is the Ostwald translation, numerous professors really find this as probably the best translation. On page 183 of that translation, which would be found in other ones, I guess this would be towards the end of chapter 3. We must assume that a person who displays moral weakness repeats the formulae of moral knowledge in the same way that an actor speaks his lines. Okay, think about that for a second. That a morally weak person, when he says, oh, stealing is wrong, I'll never steal under any circumstances. What is an actor doing? Is an actor really the person that he or she is portraying? No. He's just parroting lines, imitating. Say he's trying to imitate a virtuous person. That's probably a good way to put it. But is he really? He's just parroting lines. So Aristotle's giving us this image, and when Aristotle uses images, we should really stand up and take notice, because he doesn't use, well, he does use them a number of times, but sometimes you can hit numerous passages where he's really just dealing with slightly more abstract thought. Okay, so this is a beautiful image that he gives us, that if the morally weak person just holds some of his morality as an opinion in the same way that an actor mimics or parrots lines. And he further says, the subject, our virtue really must become a part of us. A part of us. So this is a fascinating psychological argument that Aristotle is presenting to us, right? That we can be convinced of something kind of on the surface, and we can be really, really convinced of something. If we're partially convinced of something, then and this is really the key point, which I'm setting up. And I think I dropped my chalk somewhere. That's great. Okay, here's some. If we're only partially convinced of something, if we're here, then guess what happens? Then we can be sidetracked by emotion. Bingo. Here's the payoff. Do you see how that's true? Do you see how it could be true? Now, when think about the word convince. I want you to take a look at this. I know my writing is not very good, but hopefully you can see the logic. The word convinced really in Latin means conquered by. Convincere. That, I mean, it's really, it's sunk in. Whatever the moral issue might be. And if that's true, then you will not allow emotion to sidetrack you from the proper choice and the proper action. Do you see that logic? Okay. And I think that is one of the key points of this book. That an introductory class should talk about. Another major point would be what is the difference between moral weakness and self-indulgence? That would be another very good point. Could you stop for 1 second there? Okay, what is the difference between moral weakness and self-indulgence? Now, this is different than a distinction between, okay, you have the morally weak person and a morally strong person. Those are more significant opposites, right? Okay, one is strong, one is weak. That's very easy to understand. But here we have moral weakness versus self-indulgent. If you think about it on the surface, it would seem to be that they might almost be the same. But, and I'm not going to put the Greek terms up here right now, but there is a difference between these two individuals. And it's quite important to understand the difference between the morally weak and the self-indulgent. The primary differences are that the morally weak person acts against his or her conscience. Okay, a morally weak person, this is the key point, really at least has a good opinion about what should or should not be done. They get it, but they still let emotion override their better judgment. That is a morally weak person. The self-indulgent person believes that he deserves to indulge. Whoa, okay. There's a difference there, isn't there? Now, even philosophically, psychologically, the self-indulgent person does not have much of a conscience about what he or she is about to indulge in. But the morally weak person does. So, therefore, for which one would guilt be possible? Morally weak versus self-indulgent. Do both of them feel guilt or only one?
Go ahead.
Can you think about it? What's that?
Just the morally weak?
Just the morally weak person feels guilt. Absolutely correct. The self-indulgent, it's just not an issue. I deserve to steal. I mean, they left it out. It's their fault. So, it's mine now. there's a number of people in this world like that. Whereas the morally weak person, it's, I feel guilty about it for quite some time, but they still do it. So there is some guilt there. Guilt does have a function. Guilt is a good thing. We do wrong things. When we do wrong things, we should feel guilty. It's when guilt moves into shame that there is a significant psychological problem. In other words, moving from the activity that I have done was not right to I am not right fundamentally because I have done this activity. The second would be shame. Now, shame is a problem. Moving from guilt to shame is a psychological and spiritual problem, as a matter of fact. So the morally weak person does feel some guilt, where the self-indulgent does not. It is easier to cure the morally weak person than the self-indulgent person. Can you think about why that would be the case? And this is just logical. Okay, I mean, if we're dealing, I don't have to write it on the board. If the morally weak person at least has some of his or her rationality online, so to speak, whereas their emotions or their will there's a deficit there. Well, at least they have, let's just call it half the right answer, right? But the self-indulgent person neither is right in mind nor right in activity, right in will. So Aristotle reasons that, well, the morally weak person is more reformable than the self-indulgent person. That seems rather logical, right? Now, we have studied in this class, at least very briefly, someone I think who would fundamentally disagree with Aristotle, rather holding up, he doesn't hold up morally weak people, but holding up a morally weak person higher, let's say, than a self-indulgent person. Do you have a guess about who that person might be?
Go ahead.
Yes.
Nietzsche.
Huh?
The letter Nietzsche.
Nietzsche, you're right. Yay, Mary. Okay. Nietzsche. Nietzsche did not like virtue ethics or Christian ethics very much at all. Okay. So here we have, I'm just going to morally weak. Okay. Self-indulgent, SI. And Nietzsche is much more likely to say, look, as long as your desires are truly noble, in the sense that Nietzsche thinks something is noble, something creative, something strong, something overpowering, then you should be self-indulgent. Who are these sniveling people who are just, they know what they should do, but they don't follow through with it? Okay. And of course, I'm being a little silly, but Nietzsche really disdained people like this. He did not like that at all. And now there would be another class of people that Nietzsche would also disdain, and that class of people would be like the herd mentality. Those people that are self-indulgent, but they're self-indulgent animals. They're self-indulgent about sex, about food, just chasing after power just for the sake of power. actually Nietzsche didn't really have much respect for that either, because he thought you're just playing a political game, not truly creative, not truly noble. So Nietzsche's tricky. You got to watch out for that guy. Okay. Um, Very tricky. But I think that it's worth bringing up that there are other ethical theories that would not agree, okay, with some of the conclusions that Aristotle would come to. Aristotle or Nietzsche would not agree that the morally weak person is truly superior to the self-indulgent for the reasons that I just very flippantly characterized for you, okay? And I think that that is worth mentioning. So, other differences. Morally weak people do not plot. Self-indulgent people do. Think about that for a second. I mean, a morally weak person is just the, you know, um, an easy or a difference would be, well, you have a morally weak person that knows that they probably shouldn't have, an extra beer because they're driving, but, the rest of their friends are having a couple of extra beers and they go ahead and drink that extra beer or two against their better judgment, and they can very easily get a DUI for that. They didn't plan on doing it, but they did it because really emotion got the best of them. Their desires got the best of them, okay? But the self-indulgent person might be like, look, I'm planning on drinking until somebody else has to drive, okay? And I'm planning on drinking at least 4 or 5 pints. That's my plan, okay? Really a better illustration of this might be an addict. An addict, in order to satisfy his or her desires. Now, whether or not that addiction is truly voluntary or involuntary, that's a very interesting question to pursue, okay? And I think it can be both, depending on the strength of the addiction, quite honestly. But, the addict is gonna plot about how to make sure that he or she is getting what they need, right? How am I going to steal enough so I can get, some cocaine? Or, going to plot like, well, no, I have to leave this party early because my general schedule is to make sure that I have at least a 6-pack that I can drink by myself, and all the liquor stores close at 10. So addicts are working all that out in their minds. There's some plotting going on there. But this is a very interesting question, because I do think when we're especially talking about addiction, it becomes less clear whether or not it's truly morally weak or self-indulgent. I think I've met both kinds of addicts, to be quite honest. Those addicts that think they deserve to be able to, oh, what's a little bit of meth, in the morning. I mean, it helps me going. It's like, well, you also have a toddler to take care of, so that really seems like a bad idea to me. And I don't mean to be flippant. I've dealt with all sorts of issues, and these are things that happen every day in our country. So plotting is another element. Now, I think that that's enough for some of those primary concepts. There's still several other major concepts, or at least significant concepts, that I think that we should deal with. Aristotle mentions something on page 200 that I find I find it's worth mentioning. I think it is 200. That there are some who feel less passion than they should. Now that on its face, that seems to almost be different than that. This is why I say that Aristotle's not against passions. He's not against emotions. Everything is balanced for Aristotle. Emotion is great in the proper condition, the proper persons, the proper time, the proper intensity. Wonderful. But have you ever met, and again, I've seen this in seminary classes, I've seen it doing retreats, that there's one group of people, and let's just call them the generally passionless group of people. They have a very phlegmatic, I think we would say, that's still used. It's a bit of a $10 word, but they're the laid back people. They're not terribly excitable. They usually tend to be a little more reserved, keep their cards close to their chest, we might say. And it's really terribly easy for them to accuse the more passionate people of committing sins of passion, isn't it? And I've had to mediate, I've mediated between couples, for example, where I've seen that this is true. And I try to bring out the point, well, hold on a second. Isn't it just as bad that you don't show affection? That he actually gets whatever, a little too angry or a little too passionate? Is one really better than another? One is feeling too much passion. One is feeling too little. One is excess. One is deficiency. Okay. Wow. Okay. And this depends. We have temperaments. Aristotle recognized that. Melancholic, phlegmatic, choleric, sanguine, okay? And this determines sometimes the intensity with which we will feel emotions, or maybe even sometimes the speed by which we will use our intellect to really tackle a problem. We tend to lead with one or the other. And I don't think that Aristotle would necessarily say that one is more correct than the other. That the challenge, though, is to find a balance. That if you're, say, super sanguine, the sanguines are the partiers, okay? The sanguines are the ones who know that they have a final tomorrow, but somebody says, hey, we're going to the pub, and the sanguine is up and out. Okay, let's go to the pub. Well, the sanguine needs to chill out a little and learn some more self-discipline and maybe learn to calm his or her emotions down a bit. Whereas, the more phlegmatic, let's say the more melancholic, it's like, man, you need to really learn to be more affectionate. You need to work on your compassion level. Work on getting out of yourself and relating to others. It's six one way, half a dozen the other. And I know I'm giving a tiny bit of a homily here, but I think I have an excuse. I am a priest and a monk, okay? But I say this because I think that it's important to draw some connections between some of the concepts that we are seeing in this 2,500 some odd year old text and issues that we deal with every single day. Okay, so he makes a fairly uh, a fairly strong statement concerning politics. And I know I'm repeating myself on this, but the ethics is a prelude to the politics. This is the prelude. Wouldn't it be incredible if our politicians started with Aristotle's ethics? I'm not going to say any more about that because you're probably just as annoyed about that as I am, okay? But Aristotle is a very political thinker, and he's dealing with ancient Athens. At the time, ancient Athens was roughly 200,000 or so people. Oddly enough, about half of those were slaves. And of the 100,000, several thousand actually had a vote. Because it was a very patriarchal society, so you usually had to have land and you had to be male in order to have a vote. So Aristotle is writing specifically for this group of people that is politically active, you know, like a small city or a town of individuals. And he says the following at the beginning of chapter 11. Book 7, chapter 11. It is the role of a political philosopher to study pleasure and pain, for he is the supreme craftsman of the end to which we look when we call one particular thing bad and another good in an unqualified sense. Now, there's a lot to study in there, but Aristotle, true to form, is continuing to say that politics is really the master science. And that is an arguable point, but it is a very good point, meaning that if it's the job of the political philosopher to really make laws that should be just, dealing with virtually every aspect of life, then it would stand to reason that the science that orders and makes laws for all the other sciences is the master science. Because it's politics that, in a certain sense, makes rules for biology and even religion. And I mean, it depends on how free your society is, right? If you're in China, for example, well, their government orders absolutely everything. We're a bit more free in Canada and the United States, but even in our countries, a lot of that is quite determined. And I think that sometimes we might have a few less freedoms than some people might think we do. I mean, even with science, a lot of science is governed by who gets the grants, who gets the money from the government, because scientific experiments are insanely expensive. And one of the only institutions that has the money for that is the government, or if you could be lucky enough to be sponsored by a massive corporation. And the massive corporations are usually, well, they're usually united to the government in some way, shape, or form. So even our science, our free science, how free is it? How determined is it by the government? I mean, there's no conspiracy theory in there. That's just common sense is what I'm talking about. But I think it's worth noting this view, because what Aristotle does here is he brings it to more particulars. This notion of connecting the study of ethics with the study of pleasure and pain. Okay, it's very basic. That if we're taught, and we learn this early on, to feel pleasure and pain in the proper way, at the proper times, according to the proper acts, then we will possibly, well, I erased that. Then we're much more likely to be able to, A, have the right opinions about things, and B, have the moral strength to carry through with them. I mean, if I got rewarded every time that I really did a good job as a kid, that I was truly industrious, and I was in some way punished, or at least ignored, and if I was lazy or rebellious, well, that child, when he or she becomes an adult, has a much greater chance of, well, according to Aristotle, feeling the proper pleasures and pains with various virtues and vices. Now, exactly what is meant by that is why he wrote this book. Okay, it's like, what does Aristotle mean by that? Read the book. Okay, that, I don't know how else to boil that down for you a little better. I wish I could. There is an entire discussion about pleasure at the end, which honestly I think I am going to skip. The things that we have learned about pleasure and pain already, I think, are sufficient. My second reason is that, honestly, this is, I'm not skipping it because it's not interesting. I'm skipping it because it would really deserve a lecture of its own, because it's quite nuanced. Because he discusses, is pleasure a good thing? Is it really the best thing? Or are there some bad pleasures and some good pleasures? And another reason is, I think Aristotle, in a certain sense, his answer is that it depends. And I'm supremely generalizing when I say that. And I hope you understand that. But there are, of course, good pleasures and there are bad pleasures. And if you want to learn a little bit more about that, please study the end of that book. And I think that is about as much as I'm going to go into. For one reason, my computer looks like it's about to die. And those are the basic concepts that I think are the most important to understand with book 7. We will proceed to book 8 very shortly. Thank you for your attention. Bye-bye.